I've turned away 3 shops tonight, the big man said, rain dripping off his beard, his voice flat with the exhaustion of someone who had stopped expecting kindness. You don't have to let us in. I know what we look like. Ethan Walker looked past him at 16 more riders, standing in the dark, soaking wet, their motorcycles broken down on the shoulder of a flooded Montana highway. He looked back at the man, then he stepped aside and pulled the door open wider. Get everybody inside. Nobody stands in the rain on my watch. If you've ever been the person nobody opened the door for, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel, follow this story, go all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The storm had been building since noon. By the time the sun went down over the Bitterroot Range, the sky had turned the color of a bruise, and the rain was coming in sideways, driven by a wind that had no patience for anything standing in its way. The roads through Carver County, Montana were the kind of roads that separated people into 2 categories: those who knew better than to be on them after dark in October, and those who had no choice. Ethan Walker had been working since 6 in the morning. He was 41 years old, and on most days he looked every bit of it. The blonde hair thinning at the temples, the blue eyes that had learned to read faces the way he read engines, always listening for something beneath the surface that the outside wasn't telling you. His hands were permanently stained with grease in the creases of his knuckles, the kind of stain that doesn't wash out no matter how long you scrub because it goes deeper than the skin. It becomes part of you after enough years, like grief, like habit, like the smell of an engine that's been running too hard for too long. His garage, Walker's Auto and Motorcycle Repair, sat on a 2-lane state highway 12 miles outside the nearest town. It wasn't much to look at from the road. A hand-painted sign that had been repainted 3 times over the original wood because Ethan never had enough money to buy a new one. 2 hydraulic lifts, both functional. A tool wall his father had organized, and Ethan had never rearranged because it felt wrong to move things his father had placed. A small office in the back corner with a space heater, a second-hand desk, and a pull-out cot that had become over the past several months a place where Lily sometimes slept when the day ran long and the drive home felt irresponsible. Lily was 8 years old. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's blue eyes, and she laughed at things that most children didn't notice and cried at things most adults had already learned to harden themselves against. She was in every way that mattered to Ethan, the reason he got up in the morning, the reason he stayed, the reason the garage was still open when every practical calculation said it should have closed 2 years ago. The bills were not good. They hadn't been good for a while. Ethan had done the math enough times to stop doing the math because the math always came out the same way and the answer never changed. The property taxes were 3 months behind. The parts supplier had shifted him to cash on delivery after he'd missed 2 invoices in a row. The propane tank for the space heater was down to the last quarter, and the price of a refill had jumped again. Lily needed new school supplies. Her backpack had been mended with electrical tape for 6 weeks, and Ethan had been carrying around the mental list of what she needed versus what he could actually afford, running that particular calculation in the back of his mind, the way a car runs with a check engine light on, aware of the problem not yet ready to stop. He had told himself that morning that he was going to have a serious conversation with himself about the future of the garage. He had told himself the same thing the morning before, and the morning before that. The truth, the one he kept avoiding, was this: the garage was probably not going to survive the winter. Not at the pace things were going, not with the highway getting less traffic since the county had repaved the route 30 miles east, and most people had started taking that instead. Not with the chain shop that had opened in Millhaven last spring, the one with the corporate name and the digital inspection cameras and the free coffee in the waiting room. Ethan couldn't compete with free coffee and digital cameras. What he had was his father's knowledge in his own hands and a reputation built on 17 years of never once lying to a customer about what their vehicle needed. He was starting to wonder if that was enough. The last customer of the day had picked up their truck at 4:30, a transmission job, 2 days of work, and Ethan had charged them $340 when any other shop would have charged $550 because he knew the family knew they were stretched thin, knew that kind of bill could knock somebody over if it landed wrong. He didn't regret it. He never regretted that kind of thing. But the money in the register afterward wasn't enough to make the anxiety go away. He was cleaning the last of his tools when he heard Lily stir in the back office. "Dad?" Her voice came through the half-open door, thick with sleep. Are we going home soon? 20 minutes, he called back. Maybe 30. Go back to sleep, sweetheart. A pause, then the quiet sound of her settling back against the cot cushion. Ethan dried his hands on a shop rag and stood in the middle of the garage looking at the space the way you look at something when you're trying to memorize it. The two lifts, the tool wall, the oil stains on the concrete floor that formed a kind of abstract map of every repair he'd ever done in this building. He had grown up in this garage. His father had taught him to change oil here when he was 6 years old, standing on a step stool to reach the drain pan. He had learned to rebuild a carburetor here at 12. He had cried here alone at 3 in the morning the night his wife died because the garage was the only place he could go where he didn't have to be strong for anyone. He reached up and hit the main lights. The fluorescent overhead bars flickered and died, leaving only the work lamp above the far lift casting a circle of yellow light across the empty floor. He was reaching for his jacket when he heard it. Not rain, not wind, not the usual sounds a Montana highway makes at night in October. Something else. A low, rhythmic rumbling that he felt in his sternum before he heard it with his ears. The unmistakable vibration of engines. Big engines. Almost ends. Multiple engines not in sync, each one slightly different from the others, the way a group of motorcycles sounds when you hear them approaching from a distance. Individual, alive, each one speaking its own particular language. Ethan stood still. He counted. He lost count after 10 and started again, 17. He wasn't sure how he knew it was 17. It was the kind of thing that years of listening to engines teaches you, not a precise count, but a sense of massive volume of collective sound. The sound of 17 motorcycles approaching on a flooded highway in the middle of a Montana storm was not subtle. It pressed against the garage walls. It made the work lamp flicker. It arrived before the headlights did, announcing itself the way serious things announce themselves, not with a knock, but with a presence you couldn't ignore, even if you wanted to. The headlights appeared through the small square window set high in the garage door. Then the engines began cutting out. 1, 2, 3. Not smooth shutdown, stuttering stops, the sound of machines that had been pushed past what they had left and were finally giving out. Coughs, mechanical protests, the sound of something that had been running on determination more than fuel. Ethan didn't move for a moment. He stood in the darkened garage, jacket in hand, and listened to the sounds outside and understood immediately what was happening. He had heard similar sounds before, not 17 of them at once, but the essential story was one he recognized. Travelers, trouble, rain, night, the wrong combination of all four arriving at the only building with a light still burning. He walked to the side door, the one that opened directly onto the parking area, and pushed it open. The cold hit him first, then the rain, then the sight. 17 motorcycles were pulled into his parking area in various states of distress. Some were on their kickstands. 2 were being held upright by riders who looked like they'd been holding them up for a while and were running out of the strength to keep doing it. The riders themselves were drenched, not the kind of drenched that happens when you get caught in a brief shower, but the deep, thorough soaking that happens when you've been riding in a storm for hours. When the water has gotten through every layer you're wearing and settled into your skin and your boots and the parts of your body that are supposed to stay dry, their colors were visible even through the rain. Black leather, patches, the distinct insignia of the Hells Angels, the most recognized motorcycle club in the world. The name alone carrying 20 different associations for 20 different people. Most of them formed from things people had heard rather than things they had seen. Ethan had heard the things people said. He was also his father's son, and his father had taught him something that contradicted most of what people said. The biggest man in the group stepped forward. He was enormous, not just tall, but the kind of broad-shouldered, deep-chested physical presence that seems to shift the available space around it. His beard was dark, shot through with gray, and it was plastered against his face by the rain. He wore a leather cut over what had been, at some point before the storm, a heavy flannel shirt. The cut had patches up both sides, chapter insignia, rank markings. He moved with the careful deliberateness of a large man who had learned early that his size could be misread, who had developed a habit of making his movements slow and visible so that they couldn't be mistaken for aggression. He stopped about 10 feet from Ethan. He looked at the garage behind Ethan. He looked at Ethan. He seemed to be calculating something, the odds, maybe, or the angle of this particular rejection, how it would come, what form it would take. "I'm Marcus Dalton," he said. His voice was deep and even. the kind of voice that didn't need to be raised to fill space. I'm sorry to roll up on you like this. I know it's late. I can see you were closing. I was, Ethan said. Marcus nodded. He didn't push. He just stood there in the rain, letting Ethan look at the situation without trying to rush him toward a conclusion. We've been on the road since Billings, Marcus said. Storm caught us about 40 miles back. We've got 3 bikes with fuel injection failures, 2 with electrical shorts, and 1 that threw a chain. We put in for help at the Conoco on Route 9. They wouldn't open the service door. Tried the dealership in Millhaven. They said they couldn't take more than 2 bikes and told us to come back in the morning. We've been riding on what was left for the last hour. He paused. I've turned away 3 shops tonight. You don't have to let us in. I know what we look like. That last sentence, Ethan heard everything in it, the history behind it, the accumulation of doors closed before this one, the particular exhaustion that sets into a person not from cold or rain or mechanical failure, but from being told again and again by the look on a face or the lock on a door that you are the kind of person whose problems don't deserve solving. Ethan had felt that exhaustion before in other contexts, in other forms. He recognized it. He stepped back and pulled the door wider. Get everybody inside, he said. Nobody stands in the rain on my watch. Marcus blinked, just once. A small, involuntary break in the careful composure of a man who had learned not to show when something surprised him, because surprise often meant vulnerability, and vulnerability had gotten him hurt before. But he couldn't quite hold the neutral expression for that 1 second. Something moved across his face that Ethan would think about later when he had time to think. Not gratitude exactly, not yet, but something closer to disbelief. The brief, unguarded look of someone who had prepared themselves for one answer and received a completely different one and hadn't yet updated their understanding of the world to accommodate it. You sure? Marcus said. I said, get everyone inside, Ethan said. That's my sure. They came in out of the rain. 17 people, one at a time, ducking through the side doors, stopping in the threshold to pull off their helmets, tracking water across the garage floor. The collective sound of them filled the space in a way that Ethan's garage hadn't been filled in years. The shuffle of boots, the dripping of water from leather and denim, the low murmur of voices, the particular kind of subdued human noise that a group of people makes when they are cold and exhausted and relieved, and also aware that they are guests somewhere. They weren't sure they'd be welcomed. Ethan watched them settle and made quick calculations. 17 people, 6 bikes with confirmed mechanical issues. 3 hours until the storm, according to the morning's forecast, reached its worst point. He had a space heater in the office and a propane setup under the rear work table that he'd been running for warmth. He had a coffee maker that worked half the time. He had the remnants of the lunch he and Lily hadn't finished, half a pot of chicken soup. Lily had asked him to reheat from the leftovers of 2 nights before, a package of crackers, 3 apples. It wasn't much. It was what he had. He went to the back office. Lily was awake, sitting up on the cot, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes wide and sharp. She had always woken up fast with none of the grogginess that some children had, going from asleep to fully present in a matter of seconds. She was looking toward the garage with an expression that was curious rather than afraid, her head tilted at the angle she always tilted it when she was processing something new. Dad, she said quietly, there are a lot of people out there. 17, he said. Are they okay? They will be, he said. They got caught in the storm. She was quiet for a moment. Then, do they need food because there's still soup? Ethan crouched down beside the cot and looked at his daughter's face. His wife's expression on his daughter's features, that particular openness that some people never lose and that the world keeps trying to teach them to close off. Yeah, he said. I think they probably do. I can help warm it up, she said, already moving. You can sit in here and stay warm, he said. I'll bring it out. She gave him the look that she had inherited from her mother, the one that meant she had already decided something and was simply allowing him to think he had a say in the matter. He recognized it immediately, had been recognizing it since she was 4 years old, and he knew better than to argue with it. I'll be careful, she said, and I'll be polite. What happened next was not what Ethan expected, although in truth he wasn't sure what he had expected. He had told himself in the 30 seconds between opening the door and watching 17 people file into his garage that he was doing a straightforward, practical thing. People were cold and wet, and their bikes needed fixing. He was a mechanic with a garage. The transactional logic of the situation was simple. He hadn't thought about it as anything more than that. But the thing about 17 people in a small space is that they don't stay strangers for long. The first one to speak to him after Marcus, who had taken up a quiet position near the far lift and was watching everything with the careful attention of someone responsible for everyone in the room, was a woman who introduced herself as Rachel. She wasn't what he expected, which he understood immediately said more about his expectations than about her. Rachel Morgan was in her mid-40s, compact and precise, in her movements with close-cropped hair, and the particular calm of someone who had seen enough crises that they'd stopped being crises and had become simply events to be managed. She peeled off her outer layer, assessed the garage in a few quick glances, then looked at Ethan. "Do you have a first aid kit?" she said. Tommy Hayes came down on his left arm about 30 miles back. He didn't say anything because he didn't want to stop the group, but he's been favoring it since. "Back cabinet," Ethan said, "right side." She nodded once and moved without another word, crossing the garage to find Tommy Hayes, who turned out to be a young man, 22 at most, maybe younger, sitting against the wall with the forced casualness of someone trying very hard to appear like they weren't hurting. He had a tattoo on his right forearm that was newer than the others, still sharp-edged. And he looked up when Rachel crouched in front of him with the expression of someone who wanted to wave off the attention and had already learned that waving off Rachel Morgan was not an effective strategy. "I'm fine," Tommy said. "Nobody asked," Rachel said, and opened the first aid kit. From across the garage, an older man, heavy-set with a face that had the particular weathered quality of someone who had spent decades in the open air, caught Ethan's eye and nodded toward Tommy. "Kid rode 14 miles without telling anyone," the man said. He extended a hand. "Charlie Benson, you're Walker." The sign outside said Walker. "Ethan," Ethan said and shook his hand. Charlie's handshake was the kind that told you something. Not performing strength, not playing dominance games, just a solid grip that said this is a person who has done physical work for a long time and knows it. "Retired firefighter," Charlie said without being asked. "Billings 31 years. You mind if I take a look at that bike near the left lift? The electrical short, I know enough about wiring to tell you what you're dealing with." Ethan looked at him. "Sure," he said. This was the moment he would understand later, when the evening changed its nature. Because once Charlie moved toward the bike, 2 other riders moved with him, and within 10 minutes, Ethan had 6 people working in various parts of his garage, not sitting and waiting, but actively helping, handing him tools when he asked for them, holding flashlights, in the angles he needed, relaying information from one person to the next, with the quiet efficiency of a group that had learned to function together. They weren't customers. They were working alongside him. The distinction mattered more than Ethan would have predicted. Marcus approached him around 11 o'clock when the storm had intensified and was beating against the garage walls with a kind of rhythmic insistence, as if reminding everyone inside that it was still out there, still waiting. Ethan was underneath a 2004 Road King with an electrical fault that had been feeding him false signals, the kind of intermittent problem that's the most infuriating thing in motorcycle repair. The failure that hides itself when you look for it directly and only reveals itself sideways through inference and pattern. He heard Marcus's boots on the concrete. "You want to tell me what's actually wrong with it," Marcus said. "Because the last shop told me it needed a new ECU, and I've got 17 different opinions from 17 different riders, and none of them agree." "It doesn't need a new ECU," Ethan said from under the bike. "It needs a ground wire that isn't corroded. Somebody routed it against a heat source, and it's been oxidizing for about 2 years. The ECU is reading bad data because of a connection problem, not because the ECU is bad. New ECU wouldn't have fixed anything." A pause. "How long have you been lying under this thing?" 20 minutes. "And you got all that in 20 minutes? Your previous shop was going to charge you how much for the ECU? Another pause. 1,400. Ethan slid out from under the bike, sat up, and looked at Marcus directly. "The part that's actually wrong costs about $8, he said, in 20 minutes of labor." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. There was something working behind his eyes that Ethan couldn't quite read. Not skepticism exactly, something more like recalibration, the process of updating an assessment. "Why are you doing this?" Marcus said. "And I don't mean the repair. I mean," he gestured with one hand, a sweep that took in the whole garage, the 17 people in it, the rain outside. "This, why Ethan stood up, cleaned his hands on the shop rag tucked into his belt. "My father ran this garage before me," he said. "He had a saying, I've been hearing it my whole life. A man's worth isn't measured by what he owns. It's measured by who he helps when there's nothing to gain. Marcus was quiet. He's still around, he said after a moment. Ethan shook his head. 6 years ago. Marcus nodded slowly. I'm sorry. He had a good life, Ethan said. Died in this garage, actually, which sounds worse than it was. He was working on a bike he loved. It was about as good a way to go as he would have chosen if he'd been choosing. What kind of bike? And here was the moment, the one Ethan hadn't anticipated, the one that didn't make sense to arrive when it did, in the middle of a crowded garage at 11 at night, with rain hammering the roof and 17 strangers drying off around him. It was the kind of moment that ambushes you, the kind that finds the opening you didn't know you'd left. A 68 Electroglide, Ethan said. Black and chrome. We rebuilt it together when I was 14. Took us 2 summers. He let me do things I had no business doing, whole sections of the engine, just so I could say I'd done it. So I'd know I was capable. He paused. He hadn't talked about this bike in years. The words were coming out the way words come out when they've been held back for a long time, not rushing but deliberate, like they were feeling the air. It was the last thing that was completely ours, mine and his. Where is it now? Marcus said. Ethan looked at the empty space near the back wall, where for most of his childhood and young adulthood the Electroglide had lived. Gone, he said. After my wife died, the bills got bad fast. I held out as long as I could. He picked up his wrench. He didn't want to finish the sentence, but Marcus waited with the patient attention of someone who understood that some sentences needed to be finished. I sold it to keep the garage, to keep Lily in school, to keep the lights on. He turned back to the Road King. Best decision I ever made. Hardest thing I ever did. Those 2 things can both be true at the same time. He got back to work. Marcus stood there for another moment. Then he said very quietly, almost to himself, yeah, they can. And he walked away. By midnight, Lily had fallen back asleep in the office, curled under a blanket that one of the riders, a quiet, methodical man named Danny, who hadn't said 10 words to anyone but had been steadily and efficiently making himself useful for 3 hours, had retrieved from a saddlebag without being asked and left outside the office door with no comment. Ethan saw it when he went to check on her. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at his daughter asleep under a stranger's blanket in the back of a struggling garage in the middle of a Montana storm. Something moved in his chest that he didn't try to name. When he came back out, Rachel was heating the soup on the propane burner, having organized a small rotation of people who were cold or hungry and ensuring everyone cycled through. Tom Hayes had his arm wrapped and was working one-handed handing tools to Ethan, with his good hand learning the names of things by asking what they were. What's that thing? Tom said, pointing. Flywheel puller, Ethan said. What's it do? What it sounds like, pulls the flywheel. Can I learn how to use it? Ethan looked at him. The kid was 22, maybe younger, with earnest eyes and the rough hands of someone who had been working since he was young but hadn't yet found the specific work that fit him. Come around here, Ethan said. I'll show you. Shame. At 2 a.m, with 11 of the 17 bikes repaired and the remaining 6 diagnosed and in progress, Charlie Benson sat down on an overturned milk crate near the tool wall with a mug of coffee that Rachel had pressed into his hand, and looked at Ethan with the expression of someone who has seen a lot of years and learned to recognize certain things in people. You know what you remind me of, Charlie said. I probably don't want to know, Ethan said, without looking up from the chain he was realigning. There was a guy on my crew, Charlie said. Billings Engine 4, guy named Hector, ran calls for 24 years. Never once, not one time, calculated whether somebody was worth saving before he went in. Didn't care who you were, what you'd done, where you came from, whether you were the kind of person society thought deserved rescuing. You needed help. He went. That was the whole equation. Ethan straightened up. He retired, Ethan said. Charlie shook his head. Killed on a call, 2011, house fire, Billings Heights. Guy he was trying to reach didn't make it either. He drank his coffee. But the reason I'm telling you this story is that I went to Hector's funeral and there were 460 people there. People he'd helped over 24 years. Not all of them were respectable. Not all of them were people who would have been invited to the same party. But every single one of them was there because at some point, when it mattered, Hector had done the calculation and come down on the side of the person who needed help. Charlie set his mug down. You know what his wife said at the service? Ethan shook his head. She said he never once came home and told me it wasn't worth it. Charlie picked the mug back up. 460 people. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. I'm just a mechanic, he said. That's what Hector always said, Charlie said. He said, I'm just a fireman. So, at 3 in the morning, the storm reached its peak. The rain was coming down so hard, it had turned audible in a new way. Not a steady percussion against the roof, but something closer to white noise. A full-spectrum sound that pressed against the garage walls and made the space inside feel separate from the rest of the world, sealed off its own small universe with its own rules. Ethan was working on the last bike, the chain replacement, crouched over the rear wheel with his lamp clipped to the frame and his hands doing the work by feel as much as by sight. The rest of the garage had gotten quiet. People were sleeping where they could against the walls on the chairs from the office that Marcus had brought out. One rider stretched full length on the flatbed dolly because it turned out to be the most comfortable surface available, and nobody had argued the point. Marcus was still awake. He had been awake the whole night, Ethan realized. Moving through the garage, checking on his people, exchanging a word here and there, always knowing where everyone was. It was the kind of awareness that didn't announce itself. He came and stood near where Ethan was working. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Marcus said, You know you've repaired 14 bikes tonight. 15, Ethan said. Just finished the primary on the Sportster. 15 motorcycles. Middle of the night. Storm that's keeping the highway patrol off the roads. Marcus paused. What do you want for this? Nothing, Ethan said. Ethan, I mean it. Nothing. Marcus was quiet. That's not a business model. No, Ethan agreed. It isn't. He made the final adjustment on the chain tension and straightened up. But it's how my father ran this place, and it's how I run it, and it's the only thing I know how to do that I'm not ashamed of. Something shifted in Marcus's face. Not the careful composure, not the deliberate stillness of a man managing his own size and presence in a space. Something underneath all of that. The actual face beneath the face. I lost my father too, he said. Different reasons, different time. He looked at the tool wall, at the organized rows of implements, the inherited arrangement that Ethan had never changed. You can tell a lot about a man by how he keeps his tools. Ethan followed his gaze. He was meticulous, Ethan said. He said a disorganized tool wall was a disorganized mind. He wasn't wrong. Ethan turned and looked at Marcus full. The first time all night, he'd looked at him as a person rather than as the next problem to be solved. He saw the gray in the beard, the lines around the eyes, the particular way that grief and time and responsibility for other people settle into a face. Your people are good, Ethan said, the ones you've got. Marcus glanced back across the garage at Charlie sleeping against the wall, at Rachel still making sure everyone had something warm, at Tom Hayes, who had refused to sleep and had been handing Ethan tools for 6 straight hours with the devotion of someone who had found something worth devoting himself to. Yeah, Marcus said quietly. They are. Then, without quite meaning to, the exhaustion was getting to him. By then, the way it gets to people when it's 3 in the morning and the work is almost done, and the adrenaline of the emergency has started to release its grip, Ethan heard himself say it. Not to Marcus specifically, not really to anyone. More the way a person says something that has been sitting in the middle of their chest for so long, they've stopped knowing it's there. And then suddenly the pressure of a long night and an unexpected moment shifts it loose. I'd give anything to hear that engine again, he said. The Electroglide. I dream about it sometimes, not about having it back exactly, just about the sound it made when it was running right. He shook his head, embarrassed. It was the only thing in the world that sounded exactly like him. Marcus said nothing, he just listened, which was, Ethan would realize later, exactly the right thing to do. By 4:30 in the morning, all 17 motorcycles were repaired. The storm had begun to ease, not gone, not even close, but the worst of it had passed, and the rain had dropped from violence to a steady insistence, the kind that could be ridden through if you were willing and dressed for it. The riders began to stir. People who had been sleeping against walls woke up and stretched. Charlie came to full wakefulness, the way retired firefighters do, immediately, completely assessing the room in the first second. Rachel was already checking on Tommy's arm, replacing the dressing she'd put on hours earlier. Marcus gathered his chapter. There was a brief, quiet conversation that Ethan wasn't part of, conducted in low voices near the far wall. He wasn't trying to listen. He was making a fresh pot of coffee because it seemed like the right thing to offer people who were about to get back on motorcycles in the early hours of a Montana morning. When he turned around with the pot, Marcus was standing near him. "We want to pay you," Marcus said. "I told you, Ethan." Marcus's voice was steady. "We want to pay you." Ethan set down the coffee pot. He looked at the 17 people in his garage. He thought about the propane tank and the tax bill, and Lily's backpack with the electrical tape, and the parts supplier who had shifted him to cash on delivery. He thought about what his father would say. "Make it whatever you think is fair," Ethan said, "and not a dollar more." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once as if this answer, whatever its practical implications, was exactly the right answer. They settled up. The riders began moving toward the door, helmets going on, gloves pulled from jacket pockets. The particular preparatory ritual of people about to get back on their machines. Tom Hayes stopped in front of Ethan on his way out. He stood there for a second, helmet in his hand, that earnest face working through something. "Thank you," he said, "for the tools thing, the flywheel thing, for..." He stopped, started again. "Nobody's taken time like that with me in a while." "You're a quick learner," Ethan said. Tom nodded, started to move, stopped again. "That bike you mentioned," he said, "the Electroglide, your dad's bike." He met Ethan's eyes. "I hope you hear that sound again someday." Ethan watched him go. One by one, the riders filed out into the pre-dawn dark, into the rain that was still falling, but no longer fighting. Marcus was last. He stopped in the doorway where the light from inside met the dark outside and turned back to look at Ethan standing in the middle of his garage. "My father had a saying," Marcus said. "He said the measure of a man is the doors he opens, not the ones he keeps shut." He put his helmet on. He stepped out into the rain. 17 engines, of them running properly. Now, each one speaking its own language, the particular sound signature of a machine that has been looked after and tuned and treated with the care it was owed, came alive one after the other in the parking area. The sound built the way a chord builds, each voice finding its place in the larger sound, until what you had was not 17 separate things, but one collective roar that pressed against the walls of Walker's Auto and Motorcycle Repair and filled the pre-dawn air over 12 miles of rural Montana highway and faded gradually into the distance. Ethan stood in the open doorway listening until he couldn't hear them anymore. Then Lily's voice came from behind him. "Dad." She was standing in the door of the office, the borrowed blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "Did they leave?" "They did." She looked at the wet floor, the empty coffee mugs, the small, orderly chaos of an all-night repair job. She looked at her father. "Were they good people?" she said. Ethan turned off the work lamp. In the dark, with the rain still falling outside, he thought about Charlie's story and Rachel's precision and Tom's earnest questions, and the careful stillness of Marcus Dalton's face in the moment the door opened and the world failed to confirm what he had braced himself to receive. "Yeah," he said, "they were." She took his hand. They walked out together into the rain. He locked the door behind them. Neither of them said anything else. Some things don't need saying. The morning after the storm, Ethan Walker did something he hadn't done in years. He slept past 6. Not by much. His body was too conditioned, too trained to the particular discipline of a single father running a struggling business to let him stay under for long. By 7:15, he was awake, lying on top of the covers in the small house, 8 miles from the garage, fully dressed, because he'd barely had the energy to get through the front door before his body simply stopped cooperating. Lily had been asleep in his arms by the time they reached the truck. He had carried her inside, tucked her in, and then made it approximately as far as his own bed before the night caught up with him all at once. He lay there for a moment, listening to the rain on the roof still coming down. Lighter now, the polite aftermath of the storm, rather than the storm itself, and ran a mental accounting of the night. 17 bikes repaired, 6 major mechanical failures resolved, a chain replacement, 2 electrical shorts, 3 fuel injection, overhauls, a clutch adjustment, and 6 smaller issues that had accumulated on machines that hadn't been serviced properly in too long. Roughly 14 hours of labor, all told. The cash Marcus had pressed into his hand in the early hours of the morning sat on the kitchen counter folded. And Ethan had not counted it yet because counting it felt like it would change something about the night that he didn't want changed. He thought about Tom Hayes asking what a flywheel puller was. He thought about Charlie Benson and Hector the fireman, who never calculated whether someone was worth saving. He thought about what Marcus had said in the doorway about doors in the measure of a man. He thought, despite himself, about the sound of the Electroglide the last morning it had run in his garage, the way the engine had settled into its idle, that specific voice, the one that sounded like his father thinking out loud. He had sold the bike on a Tuesday. He had stood in the parking lot and watched the new owner ride it down the highway and kept watching long after it disappeared. Long after the sound was completely gone, straining for one more second of it. He hadn't thought about that day in months. He thought about it now. He got up, splashed water on his face, and went to count the money on the counter. When he unfolded the bills, he stopped. He stood very still. He counted it again. The number didn't change. $1,400. Cash. The exact amount Marcus had mentioned, the price the other shop had quoted for a replacement ECU the bike didn't need. He looked at the money for a long time. Then he called the parts supplier in Millhaven and paid the 2 overdue invoices he'd been avoiding for 6 weeks. Lily found out about the money, the way she found out about most things. Not because Ethan told her, but because she was paying attention and had been paying attention longer than he realized. She was eating breakfast at the kitchen table when she looked up from her bowl and said, "Dad, did those people pay you?" "Some," he said. "Is it enough to fix the roof over the back lift? Because last week there was water coming in." He looked at his daughter, 8 years old, watching the garage the way he watched it, cataloging the things that needed fixing because she understood in the wordless way that children understand the things their parents try to hide from them, that the things which needed fixing were important. "I'm working on it," he said. She nodded and went back to her cereal. Then, without looking up, "I liked them. The bikers, they were polite," she said. "The big one, the one with the beard, he asked me my name. He said it like it was important, like he was going to remember it." Ethan said nothing. "Not a lot of people do that," she said. "Ask like it matters." She finished her breakfast and went to get ready for school, and Ethan sat alone at the kitchen table with his coffee and thought about a 40-something man named Marcus Dalton asking an 8-year-old girl her name and saying it back to her like it was worth keeping. 3 days later, the first one came back. Ethan was under a customer's F-150 with a brake line that had been slowly weeping fluid for 6 months when he heard boots on the garage floor, heavier than a customer's walk, more deliberate, and rolled out from under the truck to find Tom Hayes standing in the middle of the garage with his good arm in a fresh sling and the other arm holding a paper bag from the diner in Millhaven. Ethan sat up and stared at him. "What are you doing here?" he said. "Marcus said I could come," Tom said, which was not actually an answer to the question, but which Tom seemed to consider self-explanatory. He held up the bag. "Rachel said you probably hadn't eaten. She told me to bring you a sandwich. I brought 2 because I didn't know what kind you liked, and I figured if I got the wrong one, I could eat the other one." Ethan looked at him for a moment. "Your arm needs to be rested," Ethan said. "My arm is fine. Rachel wrapped it last night. Rachel told you to rest it." Tom's expression shifted in the specific way of someone caught between 2 authorities they respected equally. "Rachel said I couldn't lift anything heavy," he said carefully. "She didn't say I couldn't be here." "That's a very precise interpretation." "I know," Tom said. "Can I watch you do the brake line?" Ethan looked at this kid, 22 years old, arm in a sling, standing in the middle of a garage that wasn't his, having driven however many miles from wherever the chapter was currently camped, holding a paper bag of sandwiches like it was the most reasonable thing in the world, and felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't known was wound tight. "You know anything about brake systems?" Ethan said. "No," Tom said, "but I want to." "Sit on that stool," Ethan said. "Don't use the arm. And talk where I can hear you because I'm going under the truck and the acoustics under there are terrible." Tom sat on the stool. He started talking. What came out was not what Ethan expected, though. By now he was learning to stop expecting things from these people and simply receive what arrived. Tom Hayes was from Missoula originally, grew up in a house where the heat worked intermittently and the stability was roughly the same. He had spent 2 years after high school drifting jobs that lasted 3 months, apartments that lasted 4 relationships, that managed about the same. He had a gift for engines that he discovered purely by accident when a coworker's truck broke down and Tom, with no training and no reason to think he could help, had popped the hood and found that he simply understood what he was looking at. It was like reading, Tom said. Some people pick up a book and the words just arrange themselves into sense. That's what engines did for me. They made sense when other stuff didn't. Ethan from under the truck. You ever had any formal training? Nope, just watching and asking people who knew more than me. That's how my father taught me, Ethan said. Yeah, the sound of Tom shifting on the stool. What was he like? Ethan replaced a section of brake line, worked the fitting tight with a wrench, checked the connection. Patient, he said, relentlessly patient. He had a theory that you couldn't teach someone anything they weren't ready to receive, so the most important thing a teacher could do was wait for the moment when the student was actually open, and then move fast because the window didn't always stay open long. Silence for a moment. Then Tom said, I've been looking for a window like that for a while. Ethan slid out from under the truck. He looked at Tom. Tom was looking at the brake system with the particular focus of someone who had learned to observe carefully because they knew they wouldn't get shown twice. You're looking at the connection there, Ethan said. Yeah, is that the part that was leaking? That's the part that was leaking. What made it fail there and not somewhere else? Each. Vibration. The fitting was original equipment and the truck is 12 years old. Everything fails at its weakest point. Tom nodded slowly, filing this away. So if you check the fittings early, you catch the leak before it's a failure, Ethan finished. Yeah. Tom was quiet for a second. Then, that's not just about brake lines, is it? Ethan picked up his rag. No, he said, it isn't. So Tom came back the next day. And the day after that. By the end of the week, he had established a pattern that Ethan had not sanctioned and had also not told him to stop arriving by 9, making a pot of coffee that was noticeably better than Ethan's, because it turned out Tom had very specific opinions about coffee-to-water ratios, observing everything Ethan did and asking questions that ranged from deeply technical to almost philosophical, and leaving by 5 with a cheerful efficiency that suggested he had somewhere to be, but would rather be here. On Friday, Ethan handed him a socket wrench and showed him how to replace a wheel bearing. On Saturday, Tom did it himself, slowly with 3 corrections and 1 restart, but completely. When the wheel went back on and the bearing seated correctly, and Tom tested the rotation and felt the smoothness that meant the job was done right, his face did something that Ethan recognized from his own early years in the garage. It was the expression of a person discovering for the first time that they could create competence where there had been none. Not just follow instructions, but truly understand what the instructions were for, and therefore be able to adapt when the instructions didn't fit. That's it, Tom said. It wasn't a question. That's it, Ethan confirmed. Tom looked at the wheel, then at Ethan. Thank you, he said. You did the work, Ethan said. You showed me how. There's a difference between showing somebody how and teaching them, Ethan said. Your father ever teach you anything? Tom's face changed, not dramatically. Not the collapse that some faces do when the wrong question lands. A smaller change, a tightening around the eyes, a brief recalibration of expression. The response of someone who had made peace with a complicated answer and could discuss it without being undone by it. My dad wasn't really around for the teaching part, Tom said. He set the socket wrench down carefully. Marcus taught me stuff, patience mostly, and that. He stopped, started again. He told me once that the only thing worse than failing is failing without learning anything. So if you're going to fail, and you will make sure you take something useful away from it. Ethan thought about that. Marcus says a lot of things that sound simple and turn out not to be, Tom said. Rachel called on Wednesday of the second week. She had a precise, efficient phone manner. No small talk, no throat clearing, straight to what she needed to say, as if she had already composed the conversation in her head and was simply delivering it. I want to ask you something, she said, and I want you to hear the whole question before you answer it. All right, Ethan said. The chapter does 2 charity runs a year, one in spring, one in fall. Proceeds go to veteran services and pediatric care at Millhaven General. Last fall's run had 17 bikes. This fall's is scheduled to have 32, and we lost our mechanical support 2 weeks ago. The shop we'd been using got bought by a chain, and they're not doing volunteer work anymore. A pause, very brief. I'd like Walker's Auto and Motorcycle Repair to be the official mechanical support for this year's charity run. Pre-run inspection for every bike on-call support during the event. We pay for parts. Labor is covered by what the chapter budgets for mechanical support, which I'll be honest with you is not extravagant, but it's fair. Ethan was quiet. You said you wanted to hear the whole question, Rachel said. I heard it, Ethan said. I'm thinking. That's reasonable. He was thinking about the tax bill which the 1400 had helped but not resolved. He was thinking about the parts supplier and the roof over the back lift and Lily's school supplies. He was thinking about the calendar on his wall and whether 32 bikes in a single weekend was even physically possible for a one-man operation. 32 bikes, he said, pre-run inspections. What's the timeline? Event is in 6 weeks. Inspections can be spread across the 2 weekends before. That's workable, Ethan said. If I have help. Tom has been asking Marcus if he can spend more time at your garage, Rachel said. Marcus was waiting for you to bring it up. I told him waiting for Ethan Walker to ask for help was a strategy that required more patience than I personally have. Ethan almost laughed, almost. Tell Tom he can come, he said. Tell him to come Monday. Tell him I'll pay him what I can afford, which at the moment isn't much, but it's real. He'll come for free, Rachel said. I know he will, Ethan said. That's exactly why I'm paying him. A pause on Rachel's end. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted, not dramatically, not sentimentally, just a fraction, the way a voice shifts when the practical portion of a conversation has been handled. And what remains is something else. You're a strange man, Ethan Walker, she said. I've been told. It's a compliment. I know, he said. Thank you, Rachel. She hung up. No goodbye, she'd already moved to the next thing on her list, he was certain of it. He stood with the phone in his hand for a moment. Then he went and looked at the calendar. 6 weeks. Boom. Marcus came on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the storm. He came alone, which Ethan noticed because every previous time he'd seen Marcus, there had been other people around him, other riders, the natural gravitational field of a man who led a large group of people. Without the group, Marcus seemed simultaneously smaller and more defined the way a mountain looks different when there's nothing next to it to give it context. He didn't announce himself. He drove a truck rather than his bike, a heavy-duty Ram that had the particular seasoned look of a vehicle used for work rather than appearance, and parked outside and came in through the side door the same way he'd come in the night of the storm, stopping in the threshold and looking around to get his bearings before moving. Ethan was finishing a valve adjustment on a touring bike that belonged to a customer from Millhaven. Tom was doing brake pads on a Chevy Silverado, moving with the increased confidence of someone 3 weeks into learning a specific skill set, still careful, still deliberate, but less uncertain, his hands finding what they needed without the brief, searching hesitation that had marked his first days. Tom looked up when Marcus came in. Something passed between them. A nod from Marcus that carried more information than most people convey in a full sentence, an answering nod from Tom that said he'd received it. Then Tom went back to his brake pads. Marcus came and stood near Ethan's work area. He didn't speak immediately. He watched Ethan work the way Charlie had watched him on the night of the storm, with the attention of someone who understands what they're looking at and respects it. Tommy's getting better, he said after a while. He's a natural, Ethan said. He just needed someone to show him where to point it. He talks about you. Ethan looked up briefly. Good things, I hope. He said you treat him like he's worth teaching. Marcus's voice was level, but the words themselves carried weight. That matters more to him than you probably know. Ethan went back to the valve. He knew what Marcus was not quite saying, that there were people in Tom's history who had not treated him like he was worth teaching, and that the damage from that was the kind that didn't leave visible marks but shaped everything anyway. He's worth teaching, Ethan said. That's not charity, that's just a fact. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I want to talk to you about something, and I'm going to ask you up front to hear it out before you refuse. Ethan set down his tool. Rachel said the same thing to me last week. Rachel and I talk, Marcus said without apology. The garage. Ethan waited. The building you're in, you own it. Mortgage, Ethan said. But yes, mine. The property runs about 140 feet back from the road. You're using the first 60 for the garage and parking. Ethan was still. Marcus, I'm asking. How do you know the dimensions of my property? Charlie knows a guy at the county assessor's office, Marcus said. Charlie knows a lot of guys at a lot of offices. 31 years as a firefighter in a mid-sized Montana city, you accumulate contacts. Ethan stood up fully and looked at Marcus. What are you doing? Marcus met his eyes directly. The back 80 feet of your property is sitting there doing nothing. If you built a second bay back there, not big 4 lifts, proper ventilation, a lift for bikes specifically, you could double your throughput. The charity run alone would fill your weekends for the next 3 years. Word travels in this community, Ethan. It's already traveling. The word already landed strangely. What do you mean already? Ethan said. I mean that 17 riders told their stories to people who told their stories to other people, and 3 weeks after the worst night of our trip, we have had 6 of our people specifically route through Carver County because they wanted their bikes worked on by the man from the storm. Marcus paused. You gave us work done honestly for the price it was worth. Do you understand how rare that is to people who have spent 20 years being charged double because of what they look like? Ethan was quiet. I didn't do anything special, he said. That's the thing, Ethan. Marcus's voice shifted, not louder but denser, the way a voice gets when it's carrying something it has held for a while. That's exactly the thing. You didn't do anything special. You did the minimum, the baseline, the thing that should be so ordinary it doesn't deserve recognition. And to people who have spent their lives having the baseline withheld from them, the minimum feels like a miracle. The garage was quiet. Tom had stopped working on the Silverado. He wasn't looking at them, he was looking at his hands. But he had stopped moving, and Ethan understood that he was hearing this, the same way he always heard the things that mattered with his whole self quietly, without making it obvious. I can't accept charity. Ethan said, It's not charity, Marcus said. I'm a contractor. I have been for 20 years. I built a chapter's current clubhouse with 8 members and 3 weekends. I know what labor costs, and I know what materials cost, and I know how to pour a foundation that doesn't crack in a Montana winter. He held Ethan's eyes. I'm proposing a business arrangement. You give me access to the back of your property. I supply materials and labor, chapter labor, volunteer labor, and we build you a second bay. In return, Walker's Auto becomes the preferred shop for Hells Angels referrals across 4 counties. You price honest, you treat people fair, you do the work. We send you the business. Ethan stared at him. That's not a business arrangement, Ethan said. That's you building me a building. It's a business arrangement where the payment is paid forward instead of backward, Marcus said. The return on investment for what you did that night is not payable in one cash transaction. It has to be paid in kind, over time. Marcus, I'm not asking you to accept a gift. His voice was firm. I'm asking you to accept what you are owed, because you earned it, not by being extraordinary, by being fair. And fair should get rewarded. That's not charity. That's how things ought to work. Ethan turned away. He walked to the tool wall, the one his father had organized, the one he had never rearranged, and stood with his back to Marcus and his eyes on the rows of tools, each one in its place, each one speaking its particular language, about the man who had arranged them. He thought about the mortgage, the tax bill, the back 80 feet of property that he walked past every day without thinking about what it could be. He thought about Tom Hayes, who had come back because he was worth teaching. He thought about the night of the storm and his father's words and the particular quality of the silence in the garage at 3 a.m. when 17 people were asleep around him and he was fixing the last bike and the rain was coming down and the world outside had ceased to exist and the only thing that mattered was the work in front of him and whether he was doing it right. He thought about his father. He turned around. I want to see the plans before anything happens, he said. Marcus nodded. I want it built right, Ethan said. Not fast, right. You'll have to tell me that to my crew about 4 more times before they believe it, Marcus said. But they'll believe it eventually. And Tom stays, Ethan said. If he wants to stay, that's between him and you, but from my end, the door's open as long as he wants to walk through it. Marcus looked at Tom. Tom had started moving again on the Silverado, but the set of his shoulders had changed. The particular kind of held breath quality that a person carries when they're waiting for something important to be decided had released. Tom, Marcus said. Yeah. Tom didn't look up from the brakes. You want to stay? A pause. I already rented a room in Millhaven, Tom said, 2 weeks ago. Marcus blinked. Then something happened that Ethan had not yet seen. Marcus Dalton laughed. Not a polite social laugh, not the managed chuckle of a man in public, but a real laugh, full-bodied, surprised out of him by something he hadn't anticipated. 2 weeks ago, Marcus repeated. I figured the answer would eventually be yes, Tom said. He glanced up, and the corner of his mouth was doing something that on a less careful face would have been a grin. I just didn't know whose yes was going to be the deciding one. That night alone in the garage after Tom had left and Marcus had driven back toward the chapter house in Billings, Ethan sat on the overturned milk crate where Charlie Benson had sat on the night of the storm and did the kind of thinking that couldn't be done while moving. The evening had shifted something. He couldn't quite put his finger on the exact nature of the shift. It wasn't hope. Exactly, though, there was something in that territory. It wasn't a gratitude, though, that was present. It was something closer to what he might call orientation. The feeling of standing in a landscape you've been moving through for a long time and suddenly being able to see where you are in it. Not the whole map, not the destination, just your position. He had been for years moving sideways, surviving, keeping the garage open because closing it meant closing the last thing his father had built and the last thing his wife had believed in and the last argument available to him that his choices had been worth making. Surviving had become the goal, which meant that most of his energy went into not losing rather than into deciding where to go. Marcus's proposal had done something to that. It had placed a potential direction in front of him. He was afraid of it, he realized. Not of the work, not of the expansion or the responsibility or the possibility of failure. Afraid of wanting something again. Afraid of pointing himself at a future rather than simply moving through the present, because wanting things was the specific vulnerability that had cost him the most in his life. His wife, the Electroglide. The version of himself he'd imagined when he was 25, and the world had not yet shown him how precisely it could select the things you loved and remove them. He sat with that for a while. Then his phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't open it. His habit with unknown numbers was to let them go to voicemail and deal with it in the morning. But something made him open it. It was a photograph, blurry at the edges, taken in low light clearly from a phone and not a camera, but distinct enough to see what it was. A motorcycle, old American. The particular proportions of a 1960s Harley-Davidson, the long front end and the wide rear, the chrome glinting even in the dim light of whoever's space it was sitting in. He couldn't see the color clearly in the photograph, the lighting was wrong for that. But the shape was unmistakable to anyone who had spent 2 summers of his adolescence learning every inch of it. His hands went cold. Below the photo, a single line of text, "Is this the one?" Ethan stared at the screen. He read the message again. His pulse was doing something that he hadn't felt it do in a very long time. Not fear, not exactly, but the particular physical alertness that his body reserved for moments when something that mattered enormously was on the verge of becoming real. He looked at the photo again. The shape, the proportions, the specific angle of the front fork, the curve of the fender, the chrome trim along the tank that he had polished with his father on a Saturday morning when he was 15 years old, and his father had put the rag in his hand and said, "Take care of the things worth keeping, son, because they'll take care of you back." He couldn't be certain. The photo was bad. The lighting was wrong. It could be a different bike. It could be a different year, a different model, a similar but not identical machine. But his hands already knew. He typed back, "Where did you find this?" The response came in under a minute. "Marcus has been looking for 3 weeks. I found a lead. Don't say anything to him yet. We need to know for sure first." The message was signed with a single initial, R. Rachel. Ethan set the phone face down on the milk crate. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. He sat in the silence of the empty garage in the space his father had built and his father's father had helped him build, and tried to breathe normally. He didn't quite manage it, but he kept trying. Outside, the last of the storm clouds were pulling back, and somewhere beyond them, stars were appearing over rural Montana that hadn't been visible in days. The kind of sky that makes a person feel simultaneously very small and very precisely located, aware suddenly of exactly where they are standing on the earth and what the ground beneath them is made of and how long it has been there and how much it has held. Ethan picked up the phone. He looked at the photograph one more time. He had sold the Electroglide on a Tuesday 3 years ago. and had watched it disappear down the highway and kept watching after it was gone and told himself that was the end of that part of his life. That particular thread was closed, that some losses were necessary and therefore permanent. He was beginning to wonder if he'd been wrong about the permanent part. He didn't sleep. He tried. He went home, lay down, stared at the ceiling, and spent 4 hours having the same argument with himself that a person has when something they buried a long time ago has been quietly making its way back to the surface and is now close enough to touch. It probably wasn't the bike. The photo was blurry. The lighting was bad. A 1968 Electra Glide wasn't exactly a rare machine. Harley had produced thousands of them that year, in configurations similar enough that a man who was tired and emotional and predisposed to want something to be true could absolutely convince himself he saw it in a photograph that didn't actually show it. He knew this. He was aware of the mechanism, the way hope distorts perception, the way grief makes the familiar appear in the unfamiliar. It probably wasn't the bike, but at 2 a.m. he gave up on sleep, drove back to the garage and sat at his father's desk with his phone and looked at the photograph again for the 14th time. The shape of the front fork, the particular angle where the tank met the frame, the chrome trim line that his father had replaced in 1987 because the original had started to pit and had chosen a slightly heavier gauge than stock because he wanted it to last, and which therefore sat a fraction differently than it would on a factory original, a difference visible only to someone who knew where to look. Ethan knew where to look. He called Rachel at 6:15 in the morning. She answered on the second ring, which told him she'd been awake. "The trim line on this tank," he said without any preamble. "In the photo, can you get a closer shot of it?" A brief silence, then "You saw it. I need a closer shot." Ethan." Her voice was careful. Not soft. Rachel Morgan didn't do soft as a default setting, but careful in the way of someone who was managing something fragile without wanting to acknowledge that it was fragile. "I need you to understand that the lead I found might not go anywhere. The bike has changed hands at least twice since you sold it. The second owner might have modified it. The third might have painted it. I found a listing that matches the description Marcus gave me, but I haven't confirmed anything yet." "Where is it?" Ethan said. "Ethan, Rachel, where is it?" She exhaled. "A private collector in Spokane. He bought it at an estate auction 14 months ago. He's been restoring it, or trying to. His listing says he's looking to sell because the restoration is beyond his skill level and he doesn't want to do it wrong." Ethan was on his feet. "The listing is still up." "As of last night, yes." "Does Marcus know?" "Marcus knows I found a possible lead," Rachel said. "He doesn't know the details yet. I wanted confirmation first. I didn't want to." She stopped. "Marcus has been running on this for 3 weeks. He called in favors I didn't know he had. He had Danny pulling collector databases at midnight. He had Charlie working his contacts from his firefighter days in Billings, because apparently retired firefighters have a network that rivals the CIA for reach, and Marcus was using all of it. I didn't want to get his hopes up until I knew." Ethan pressed his thumb and a forefinger against the bridge of his nose and stood in the middle of the garage in the early morning dark. 3 weeks, he said. "The night they left your garage," Rachel said. "Marcus didn't sleep on the ride home. He gathered the chapter the next morning and told them what he wanted to do." She paused. "He said you'd given them back something they didn't know they'd lost. He said, and this is Marcus, so he said it in 4 words instead of 40, he said, 'We owe that man a debt that money can't cover.'" Ethan sat down on the milk crate. He didn't say anything for a moment because there was nothing to say that wouldn't sound smaller than what he was feeling. "Get me the contact information for the collector," he said finally. "I will," Rachel said. "But Ethan, let Marcus do this, please. It's my father's bike." "I know whose bike it is," she said, "and Marcus knows, and that's exactly why it has to be him who goes and gets it, because this isn't about a motorcycle." Her voice was direct, zero ambiguity. "This is about what that night meant to 17 people. You let them in when everyone else closed the door. You fixed their machines and fed them your family's food, and you talked to them like they were human beings worth talking to. And then you told them the one thing you'd never told anyone else. And now they need to do something with that. They need to be able to give something back that has the same weight as what you gave them." She stopped. "Don't take that away from them by doing it yourself." The garage was very quiet. Outside, the first gray light of morning was starting to find the edges of the window. "All right," Ethan said. "All right," she said back. "But you'll tell me the minute there's confirmation." "The minute," she said. She told Marcus that same morning. Ethan wasn't there for the conversation. It happened in a chapter meeting he wasn't part of, in a room he'd never seen, among 17 people whose internal dynamics he understood only from the outside. But Tom was there, and Tom, who had developed the unconscious habit of reporting the things he thought Ethan would want to know, without quite recognizing that he was doing it, told him about it afterward. Marcus went quiet for about 30 seconds, Tom said. He was replacing an alternator on a customer's Jeep and speaking to the underside of the hood, which is a long time for Marcus to be quiet. Then he said, "Give me the contact. Give me the address. We're going this week." "This week," Ethan said. "That's what I said," Tom said. He looked at me like I'd asked whether gravity was real. He said, "Tommy, that bike has been waiting in a barn in Spokane for over a year. 3 more days is 3 more days. We're going." Ethan was quiet. "Who went?" Tom looked over at him. "5 of us. Marcus, Charlie, Danny Reeves, Pete Okafor, and me." He paused. "Rachel would have gone, but she had a 12-hour shift she couldn't get covered." "You drove to Spokane." 3 hours each way, Tom said. "Left before sunrise so Marcus could be there when they opened." And Tom put down the ratchet he was holding. He turned around and leaned against the Jeep, and the expression on his face was one Ethan hadn't seen on him before, a kind of weight, a seriousness underneath the usual openness. "We walked into that collector's garage," Tom said slowly, "and there were probably 40 bikes in there, all different ages, all different conditions. And Marcus walked in and went straight to one of them without looking at anything else, like he knew exactly where it was." Tom shook his head slightly. He didn't say anything for a minute, just stood there. Charlie came and stood next to him. Then Charlie put his hand on Marcus's shoulder, and they just looked at it. Ethan had stopped breathing somewhere in the middle of that. "Was it?" he started. "Yeah," Tom said. "It was." The negotiation had not been simple. The collector, a man named Gerald Fitch, 60 years old, who had built his collection over 30 years and did not, under ordinary circumstances, feel any pressure whatsoever to sell anything, had not been planning to part with the Electroglide on a Tuesday morning in October to 5 leather-vested Hells Angels members who had shown up without an appointment. This was what Charlie explained to Ethan 3 days later, sitting at the workbench over coffee with the patience of a man who had negotiated for 31 years with burning buildings and was therefore not easily rattled by Gerald Fitch. "He opened the door," Charlie said, "and he saw Marcus, and his face did the thing that everybody's face does. The thing where 20 years of headlines about motorcycle clubs plays out in about 2 seconds and decides the next 10 minutes for you before any actual information can arrive." "What did Marcus do?" Ethan said. He said, "Mr. Fitch, I'm Marcus Dalton. I called yesterday about the Electroglide. I have cash and I have a story. I'll give you both if you'll give me 5 minutes." Charlie drank his coffee. Gerald Fitch let us in. The story Marcus told was not complicated. He told it the way he apparently told most things, plainly, in the minimum words that conveyed the essential truth without embellishment or emotional manipulation. He told Gerald Fitch about the storm, about the 17 bikes, about a mechanic in rural Montana who opened his door at 11 o'clock on the worst night of the year and worked until 5 in the morning and refused payment beyond what he considered fair, and told them at 3 in the morning, when he was too tired for the guard to stay up, about the bike he had built with his father and sold to save his daughter and his garage. Gerald Fitch had listened to the whole thing without speaking. Then he said, "What did you say this mechanic's name was?" "One Ethan Walker," Marcus said. Gerald Fitch was quiet for a moment. "The Walker Garage," he said. "Off Route 12 in Carver County." Marcus went very still. "You know it," he said. "My brother drove a truck through a Montana winter for 30 years, Gerald said. He had a list of mechanics he trusted. 3 names on the list. Walker's was one of them. He said the man there was the only mechanic between Billings and Missoula who never once put a part on his truck that didn't need to be there." He looked at Marcus. "He passed away 2 years ago. My brother." Nobody said anything. Charlie told this part of the story to Ethan slowly, with the weight it deserved, letting the silence that had been in the room and exist for a moment between them in the garage, the same way it had existed between 5 men and Gerald Fitch in Spokane. Then Gerald Fitch had said, "Make me a fair offer. I don't need to be made rich. I just need to know the bike is going somewhere that matters." Marcus named a number. It was fair. Ethan would understand this when he learned it later. It was the number a person names when they are not trying to take advantage and are not trying to perform generosity, just trying to land on the thing that's right. Gerald Fitch shook his hand. "Tell him I'm glad it found its way back," Gerald said. "Tell him my brother would have been glad too." The bike came back to Montana on a flatbed truck that Marcus had arranged with the precision that Ethan would later find characteristic. Marcus did not do things approximately, and when something mattered, it was done correctly or not at all. But Ethan didn't know this yet, because Marcus hadn't told him. This was the part that Ethan would spend the next 3 weeks navigating, the knowledge that something was happening, that pieces were in motion, that Rachel's single initial text, and Tom's careful partial revelations, and Charlie's measured storytelling all pointed towards something being prepared, and the deliberate choice by everyone involved to keep the exact shape of it from him until they were ready. It should have frustrated him. Strangely, it didn't. What he felt instead was something that took him several days to identify because it was unfamiliar enough that he didn't have a ready category for it. It was the feeling of being known, not observed, not watched. Known, the specific quality of trust that exists between people who have paid enough attention to understand what matters to you and are acting on that understanding without requiring your direction or your gratitude in advance. He had not felt known by a group of people in a very long time. His wife had known him. His father had known him. Lily knew him in the incomplete developing way that a child knows a parent fully in some places, not yet in others, the relationship still in the process of building itself. But this, a group of people he'd met once in a storm, acting on a 3 a.m. confidence, he hadn't even realized he'd spoken out loud. This was something different. He kept working. That was the only thing he knew how to do with big feelings. Work. The charity run was 3 weeks away when things at the garage began to change in ways that were too systematic to be coincidental. It started with a phone call from a rider in Billings named Pete Okafor, who needed his Dyna serviced before the run, and had heard from Marcus that Walker's was the place to bring it. Then 2 more calls, one from a woman named Sandra, who needed tires and a chain on her Sportster, and one from an older rider named Ray, who hadn't had his touring bike properly inspected in 2 years and wanted it done right before he put 600 miles on it. 4 bikes in a week. None of them people Ethan had met before. The week after that, 7. The week after that, 11. Tom was working full days by then, competent enough on the standard jobs to handle them independently, asking Ethan in for the complex ones, and watching carefully when he did. They had developed a working rhythm, the particular efficiency of 2 people who have found their relative positions in a shared task and stopped needing to negotiate it each time. Tom knew what Ethan needed before he was asked for it. Ethan had begun to notice when Tom made a decision, and to check it not with suspicion, but with the professional curiosity of someone watching a student think and assessing the reasoning rather than just the outcome. On a Thursday, Tom made a call on a brake job that Ethan would have made differently and said so. Tom listened. He asked 2 questions. He reconsidered. Then he said, "I still think my way works." "Walk me through why," Ethan said. Tom did. Ethan was quiet for a moment at the end. "You're right," he said. Tom blinked. "I am." "Don't look shocked. You'll be right plenty of times. The skill is learning to know when you are and when you aren't." Ethan handed him the torque wrench. "Finish the job your way, but tell me exactly what you're doing as you do it, because I want to understand your reasoning from the inside." Tom finished the job. It was right. When the customer came to pick up the car and Tom rang up the ticket, the man, a farmer from 30 miles out in his 60s, the kind of man who assessed garages the way he assessed horses, by whether they were what they appeared to be, looked at Tom for a moment. "You the new man," he said. "Yes, sir," Tom said. "You know your business." "I'm learning it," Tom said. The man looked at Ethan. "You taught him?" "Working on it," Ethan said. The farmer nodded, satisfied with this answer, in a way that a more effusive answer would not have satisfied him. He took his keys. He looked around the garage one more time. "My dad used to bring his truck here," he said, "to the man before you." "I know," Ethan said. "Glenn Mayhew, 82 F Series with a bent frame from that ditch on Route 9. The farmer stared at him. "My father told that story for 20 years, the man said. Your father was a good man, Ethan said. The frame took 3 days to straighten properly. He came in every morning while I was doing it just to see the progress. My father let him watch because he said a man who loves his truck deserves to see it come back to him. The farmer stood there for a moment with his keys in his hand and an expression on his face that Ethan recognized because he had seen it recently more than once, the expression of someone who has just discovered that a place they thought was simply a building is in fact a repository, a keeper of things, a holder of stories they thought had passed out of existence. He left without saying anything else. He didn't need to. Tom watched him go. Was that true? Tom said. The frame story. Every word, Ethan said. How do you remember all of that? Ethan began organizing his tools. Because every vehicle that comes through here is somebody's father's truck, he said, or somebody's grandfather's car, or somebody's first bike that they saved 2 years for. When you understand that, you stop thinking of it as a job. Tom was quiet. Then what do you think of it as? Ethan looked at the tool wall, at his father's arrangement. A trust, he said. People are trusting you with the things they need to keep moving. That's not small. Rachel called on a Monday with news that hit Ethan like a change in air pressure, the kind you feel before a storm, before a drop in temperature, before something large and invisible shifts into position. We have a problem, she said. Ethan set down his coffee. Tell me. The bike is in Montana. It arrived 4 days ago. She paused, and in the pause he heard the shape of what was coming. Marcus has been restoring it. He and Danny and Pete have been in the chapter garage every night this week. The mechanical work is done. Marcus is good. He knows what he's doing with an engine. But there's a section of the tank that has a dent that somebody put in it at some point in the last 3 years, and the chrome is pitted on the left exhaust. And Marcus is... She stopped again. He's being very exact about it. He wants it to go back to Ethan in the condition it was in when Ethan's father had it. Not restored, returned. Ethan's chest tightened. Rachel. He found a chrome restorer in Missoula who's done work for the Smithsonian, she said. He's driving the exhaust pipes down there this week. The tank dent... Her voice shifted, and he recognized the shift now. The fraction of unguardedness that appeared when Rachel Morgan was moved by something and hadn't had time to manage it back into professional composure. Charlie found an original panel from a parts bike in Wyoming. Correct year, correct color code. He drove there and back in a day. Charlie drove to Wyoming in a day. He didn't mention it to anyone until he got back, Rachel said. He just said he had an errand. Ethan sat down. How many people are working on it? He said. At this point, most of the chapter. Danny is researching every modification your father made so they can verify them against what's there. Tom apparently emailed him a description of the bike from what you told him, which she almost laughed, a sound Ethan hadn't heard from her before. Tom took notes on his phone during one of your conversations. He has 3 pages. Tom had taken notes. Tom, who had shown up with sandwiches and a sling and asked what a flywheel puller was, had been taking notes on everything Ethan told him about his father and his father's motorcycle because Tom had understood before Ethan did where this was heading. He didn't say anything to me, Ethan said. He asked Marcus if he should, Rachel said. Marcus said no. Marcus said some things are better built in silence. Ethan pressed his palm flat against the workbench. He needed the physical contact, the solidity, something to hold on to while his understanding of the past 3 weeks rearranged itself. The rides who had come in for service, the organic increase in business that he had attributed to word of mouth without examining the source too carefully. Tom's careful, gradual collection of information about the bike, the color, the year, the modifications, the specific way his father had rewired the headlight because he didn't trust the factory connection. All of it deliberate, all of it organized. A careful architecture of preparation that had been happening around him while he worked, while he slept, while he sat on a milk crate at 3 a.m. and talked to Marcus about his father and let something slip out that he had not said to anyone in 3 years. He had given them an unguarded moment. They had built a cathedral from it. Rachel, he said, and his voice came out different than he intended, quieter, rougher at the edges. Tell Marcus, don't tell him anything yet, she said. Let them finish. They need to finish it properly. She paused. They need to give it to you right. That matters to them as much as what it means to you. Maybe more. He understood that. He hated that he understood it because it meant he had to wait, and waiting had never been the thing he was good at, but he understood it. How long, he said. 2 weeks, she said. Maybe less, she considered. He's not sleeping, Mum. None of them are. Tell them to sleep, Ethan said. Tell them yourself, she said. They won't listen to me either. In the 2 weeks that followed, the garage became the fullest it had been since Ethan's father was alive. Word had spread, not in the way that advertising spreads, not in the blunt force manner of reputation management, but in the organic, almost invisible way that genuine things spread in small communities, carried from person to person by the specific credibility of someone who has personal knowledge. The farmer with the F-Series came back for an oil change and brought his son. Sandra with the Sportster sent 3 friends. A veteran named Carl, who had served 2 tours and come home to find that most civilian institutions felt profoundly alien to him, came in with a Softail that hadn't been properly maintained since he got back, and Tom spent 40 minutes with him while he waited. Not about the bike, but about being home, about finding things that felt real. And Carl left with a bike that ran and the number of AVA resource that Rachel had texted Tom specifically to pass along because Rachel paid attention to people and cross-referenced what she knew. Ethan watched all of this. He watched Tom grow into the space. He watched his garage become something he hadn't planned and couldn't have manufactured a place with a quality that certain places acquire when enough people have been genuinely cared for inside them. The tool wall, the coffee, the way Tom talked to customers, the way Ethan talked to customers. The 17 mugs someone had left behind lined up on the shelf above the workbench, which nobody had moved because they had become, without anyone deciding it, part of the inventory. On a Friday afternoon, Lily came from school and did her homework at her father's desk. Tom was showing her how to read a tire tread gauge. Ethan, from across the garage, watched his 8-year-old daughter hold a gauge to a tire and call out the measurement with the precision of someone who intended to get it right. Good, Tom said. What does that tell you? That it's getting close, Lily said. That it needs to be watched. Exactly. Tom looked up and caught Ethan's eye across the garage. Something passed between them, not spoken, not required to be the particular acknowledgement between 2 people who are both witness to something that matters. Ethan went back to work. That evening, after Lily had fallen asleep in the office and the last customer's car had been collected, Ethan's phone rang. Marcus. He picked up. How are you doing? Marcus said. First time he'd called and opened with that. I'm all right, Ethan said. Marcus, it's almost done, Marcus said. His voice was different, not measured, not careful. Something had loosened in it. I wanted to tell you myself. It's going to be ready in 4 days. Ethan leaned against the workbench. Is it? He couldn't finish the sentence the way he meant to, so he finished it differently. Is it right? Marcus was quiet for a moment. Ethan, he said, I have been building things and fixing things for 30 years. I have never in my life put more care into any object than the men and women in this chapter have put into this machine in the last 3 weeks. His voice was even, but underneath it was something that Ethan recognized, the quality of emotion that has been held under control for a long time and is now very close to the surface. The chrome on that exhaust looks like the day it left the factory. The tank is solid. The wiring is exactly as your father left it. Every modification, every choice he made, it's there. He stopped, started again. Danny found a photograph, old one, black and white. You and your father in front of the bike. You're about 15. Your father's hand is on the seat. Ethan's throat closed. Where did he find that? He managed. He didn't say where, Marcus said. He said you'd understand how. And Ethan did. Tom's notes, the stories he'd told while working, while tired, while not thinking about who was listening and what they were storing. Somewhere in those 3 pages of notes, Ethan had apparently mentioned someone who might have a photograph. Someone he had forgotten he'd mentioned. Someone Tom had found. It's going on the bike, Marcus said. Laminated under the seat, where you used to keep your father's registration. Ethan was not going to respond to that. He couldn't. He pressed his thumb and forefinger against his eyes the way he had that first night after Rachel's text, and breathed through it the way you breathe through things that are too large for the normal pace of breathing. 4 days, he said when he could. 4 days, Marcus confirmed. Then I want to ask you something. Ask. That night, Marcus said, when you opened the door, when you stepped back and told us to bring everyone inside, were you scared? Ethan considered this honestly. He hadn't been asked it before. Not of you, he said. I was scared of something else. What? Of closing the door, Ethan said. My father would have known. He would have found out somehow. He always did. He exhaled slowly. I couldn't have lived with the version of myself that locked that door. Marcus was quiet for a long time. My father was not a good man, he said finally. The words came out clean and without self-pity, the statement of a fact that has been examined from enough angles to lose its power to wound. He closed doors. For most of my life, I watched him close doors. And I made a decision very young that I was going to be the person who opened them, no matter what it cost me, no matter what it looked like, no matter who was standing on the other side. He paused. When you opened yours, when a stranger did the thing I'd spent 30 years trying to train myself to do, I want to be honest with you, it hit harder than I expected. Ethan didn't say anything. He didn't need to. They were quiet together on the phone for a moment, two men in two different buildings in rural Montana, understanding each other completely through the particular medium of shared experience and the specific silence of people who don't need to fill every available space with words. 4 days, Ethan said again. 4 days, Marcus said. He hung up. Ethan stood in the empty garage. The tool wall, the 17 mugs, the space heater in the back corner, the 2 hydraulic lifts and the stool where Tom sat, and the workbench where Lily did her homework, and the oil-stained map of every repair he'd ever done on this floor. His father's garage. His garage. He thought about Gerald Fitch's brother, a man he'd never met, a truck driver who had kept a list of 3 names, who had told someone that Ethan's father's garage was one of the only places between 2 cities where they'd never put a part on his truck that didn't need to be there. A man who was gone now, who had never known the effect of his loyalty, who had carried that knowledge through 30 winters and left it behind in the form of his brother's willingness to let something precious go to the right place. He thought about how many Ethan Walkers there were in the world who would never know the names of the people their fathers had helped. He thought about what it meant to find out. He thought about 4 days, and he got back to work because there was always work to be done, and the work was the thing that kept him honest, and being honest was the only way he knew to hold up his end of what had, quietly, without announcement, without ceremony, become the most important story of his life. Tom made the coffee. He made it the way he always made it, the specific ratio he'd calibrated over 4 months of mornings in this garage, the one that Ethan had stopped commenting on because there was nothing to comment on. It was simply correct. He moved through the small kitchen area with the ease of someone who had long since stopped being a guest in a space and had become part of its daily operation, and the sound of it, the water running, the machine starting. The particular domestic rhythm of coffee being made for people who needed it was one of the most ordinary sounds in the world, and also in this specific moment, one of the most grounding. Ethan needed grounding. He was standing near his father's motorcycle, one hand resting on the seat, and he was doing the thing he did when feeling ran too large for the available container. He was cataloging practical things. The charity run was in 2 weeks. Gerald Fitch was coming from Spokane. 32 bikes needed to be pre-inspected. The second bay construction was scheduled for the weekend after the run. He had a transmission job waiting for Monday morning and a fuel system on a touring bike that Tom was ready to handle independently for the first time. Practical things, real things. The scaffolding that holds a person upright when the ground underneath them is doing something unexpected. Charlie appeared at his elbow. He didn't say anything. He just stood there in the way Charlie stood near. Things solidly, without apology, taking up his space in the world with the settled permanence of someone who had spent 3 decades walking into situations that were on fire and had stopped being rattled by lesser forms of intensity. He had a mug of the new coffee. He handed it to Ethan without asking if Ethan wanted it. Ethan took it. "You all right?" Charlie said. "You keep asking me that," Ethan said. "You keep giving me the same non-answer, which tells me the question still needs asking." Charlie drank his own coffee. "The photograph, under the seat. Have you looked at it yet?" Ethan had not looked at it yet. He knew it was there. Marcus had told him it was there. Charlie had warned him what was written on the back. He had not yet been able to bring himself to lift the seat and take it out, because the evening had already given him more than he knew how to process, and he had a floor-level awareness that the photograph was going to be the thing that broke through whatever remained of his composure, and he wasn't ready to do that in front of 17 people. Even 17 people who had already watched him go to his knees in the rain. "Not yet," he said. Charlie nodded. He didn't push it. "It'll keep," he said. "It's been in a box in Bozeman for 6 years. Another hour won't hurt it." From across the garage, Marcus's voice rose briefly. He was talking to Pete and Danny about logistics for the run, the route, the weather forecast, the timing of the benefit dinner that followed the ride. His voice in logistics mode was different from his voice in conversation. Faster, more precise, the particular efficiency of a man who organized large groups of people regularly and had developed a compressed language for it. Ethan watched him and thought about what Marcus had said. Adoption. The family rather than the club. The obligations that were simply the things Ethan already did, given back to him as a framework. He thought about his father. His father had never needed a framework. He had simply acted every time from the same place with the same consistency, and the framework had never been articulated because it had never needed to be. It was in the doing. Ethan had thought for years that he was carrying on his father's garage. He was beginning to understand that he had been carrying on his father. Rachel came and stood near him. She had the look she got when she had something to say and was deciding how to say it. The brief internal audit of a woman who valued precision and applied it to language as rigorously as she applied it to everything else. I want to tell you something about why Marcus started looking for the bike, she said. Something he won't tell you himself because he considers it personal, but that I think you should know. Ethan waited. His father, Rachel said. The one he mentioned to you, the one who closed doors. He died 18 months ago. They hadn't spoken in 11 years. She held her mug in both hands. Marcus went to the funeral, sat in the back, didn't speak to anyone. He told me afterward that the thing that stayed with him wasn't grief exactly. It was the recognition that some things become permanent when you run out of time. That some doors close not because either person decided to close them, but because they kept not opening them day after day until the person on the other side was simply gone. Ethan was very still. He's been thinking about permanence ever since, Rachel said. About which things can be recovered and which things can't. About what it means to find something before it becomes irretrievable. She looked at him directly. When you told him about the bike at 3 a.m, he understood it immediately. Not as a story about a motorcycle, as a story about something that was lost that didn't have to be, something that could still be found. She paused. He needed to find it. Not just for you. He needed to prove to himself that it was possible. That some things, if you move fast enough, if you care enough, if you're willing to do the work, some things come back. The garage noise continued around them. People talking, Tom moving, coffee being drunk. Ethan stood inside all of it and understood something about Marcus Dalton that made everything that had happened in the past 4 months rearrange itself into a different and more complete shape. He doesn't know you're telling me this, Ethan said. He would tell me I'm being sentimental, Rachel said. He'd be wrong, but he'd say it. She picked up her coffee. Now you know anyway. An hour later, the garage had settled into the particular comfortable noise of people who have passed through an intense shared experience and are now on the other side of it, in the pleasant lowland where the pressure has released and what remains is warmth and food and the easy conversation of people who have earned their ease. Pete Okafor had produced food from somewhere, a fact that seemed to surprise no one, suggesting this was a characteristic of Pete's that the chapter had long since incorporated into their expectations. Sandwiches, a container of something hot that turned out to be soup, the specifics of which remained unclear, but which was universally approved. Paper plates and the pragmatic acceptance of people who eat where the eating is rather than where the setting is optimal. Carl the veteran had ended up in a long conversation with Tom that had migrated from motorcycles to military service to the particular difficulty of finding things that felt real after a very long time of operating in extremity. Tom listened with the full-body attention he gave everything, asking questions that were simple on the surface and showed underneath that he had been paying close attention to something more than the words. Ethan watched this from across the room. He thought about Tom's first day, the sandwiches, the sling. What's a flywheel puller? The 3 pages of notes on his phone that had become, without Tom knowing, it was what they were, the blueprint for a restoration that had brought back something Ethan had classified as permanently gone. He walked over to where Tom was sitting with Carl. He pulled up a stool. Carl looked at him, the direct assessing look of a man who had learned to read new arrivals quickly. Tom says you've been teaching him, Carl said. He's been teaching himself, Ethan said. I've been pointing at things. Carl considered this. That's how the best instruction works, he said. In the service, the officers I respected most, they didn't tell you what to think. They told you where to look. My father said something similar, Ethan said. Tom mentioned your father, Carl said. The garage, the bike. He glanced toward the Electroglide near the back wall. Is it what you thought it would be? Getting it back. Ethan looked at the motorcycle. He had been asking himself some version of this question since the cloth came off in the rain. Whether the reality matched the years of accumulated longing. Whether the thing he had built around the memory of the bike, the significance he had layered onto it through 3 years of absence, was fair to the actual object, or whether the actual object could carry the weight of what he'd made it mean. It's more, he said, because of how it came back. Carl nodded slowly. Yeah, he said, that's how it usually works. The thing itself is just a thing. What makes it matter is the story it's carrying by the time it reaches you. He said this plainly without sentiment, the way a man says something he has earned the right to say through sustained contact with loss and recovery in their most undeniable forms. Tom was listening with the expression of someone storing something. Write that one down, Ethan told him. Tom already had his phone out. At 9:30, people began to move toward departure. The chapter had a long ride back, or most of them did. A few were staying locally at the motel in Millhaven, or at someone's property on the county road. The logistics were handled with the quiet efficiency of a group that had done this many times, people drifting toward their bikes, checking their gear. The particular pre-departure ritual that Ethan had watched once before 4 months ago in the pre-dawn dark. That time they had left, and he had stood in the doorway listening to the sound of them fade. This time was different. He understood now that the sound wouldn't fade into loss. It would fade into distance, which was a different thing entirely, a thing with a return built into it. Gerald Fitch arrived at 9:45. He was not what Ethan had assembled in his mind from the facts available. A 60-year-old collector in Spokane who had bought a motorcycle at an estate auction and couldn't finish the restoration and had listened to a stranger tell a story and decided to fund a building because of a truck driver he missed. Ethan had expected someone older seeming, somehow, more formal. Gerald Fitch was a broad man with a gray beard shorter than Marcus's, and the particular physical ease of someone who had done manual work for most of his life and carried that relationship with his body into everything else. He drove a truck that was older than Tom and stepped out with the unhurried movement of a man who had stopped rushing somewhere in his 50s and had found that life accommodated this. He looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at him. Ethan Walker, Gerald said. It was a statement, not a question. He said the name the same way Marcus had said Lily's name to her on the night of the storm, like it was worth keeping. Gerald Fitch, Ethan said. They shook hands. Gerald's grip was the same kind as Charlie's honest no performance. The handshake of a man who had nothing to prove by it. My brother talked about this place, Gerald said. About your father. He said exactly this, I remember, because I've thought about it 100 times since he passed. He said there are 3 shops between Billings and Missoula. I'd trust with a vehicle I actually needed to get home in. And he named yours first. Ethan absorbed this. I never knew him, Ethan said. He knew this place, Gerald said. That was enough for him. He looked past Ethan at the garage, at the sign above the door, at the 2 lifts visible through the window. I wanted to see it. I wanted to see what kind of place earns that kind of loyalty from a man who drove trucks through Montana winters for 30 years. And was not, I will tell you honestly, easy to impress. Come inside, Ethan said. Gerald came inside. He moved through the garage the way people move through it when they understood what they were looking at, not as a tourist, not as an outsider, but with the recognition of someone who spoke the language of workspaces and could read the information they contained. He looked at the tool wall. He looked at the lifts. He looked at the motorcycle near the back wall and stopped. That's it, Gerald said. It wasn't a question either. That's it, Ethan said. Gerald stood in front of the Electroglide for a long moment. He reached out and touched the chrome on the tank, just a brief contact the way you touch something that belongs to someone else, with permission implied but still careful. They did good work, he said. They did extraordinary work, Ethan said. Gerald nodded. He stepped back. He turned to look at Ethan with an expression that was direct and unguarded and slightly uncomfortable, the expression of a man who had decided to say something he wasn't entirely sure how to say. My brother left me money, Gerald said. More than I need. We didn't have children, either of us. My wife passed 4 years ago. I've been sitting on it, trying to figure out what to do with it that would have made sense to him. He stopped, started again. When Marcus came and told me that story, I didn't give him an answer right away. I told him I needed to think about it. And I went inside and I sat in my chair and I thought about my brother. And I thought about what he would do with a pile of money he didn't need, and a story about a mechanic who worked all night for free in a Montana rainstorm and then told 17 bikers that decency wasn't special. It was just what you did. He looked at Ethan. He would have driven here himself, Gerald said. He'd have shown up on a Tuesday morning and told you he wanted to help build a second bay, and he'd have worked until it was done. That's what he would have done. His jaw tightened briefly. Since he can't, I'm doing it instead. That's not charity. That's me finishing something he started 30 years ago, when he put your father's name on a list. The garage was very quiet. Ethan found that he had no response that was adequate. He said the only thing that was true. Thank you, he said, for the money, for coming, for what your brother said about my father. He stopped. He never knew it mattered like that. Good men rarely do, Gerald said. That's what makes them good men. They're not keeping a ledger. Marcus, who had been standing near the coffee table with the careful non-presence of a man who understood when a conversation didn't need a third party, said quietly, "None of us are." The charity run happened on a Saturday in late October. The morning was cold and clear, the particular clarity that follows a week of overcast. Like the sky has been saving it all the blue it had been holding back, released at once, sharp and deep and enormous over the Montana landscape. 32 bikes arrived at Walker's Auto starting at 7 in the morning, their riders in layers against the cold, their machines tuned and inspected over the previous 2 weekends by Ethan and Tom, working in shifts that sometimes ran until 10 at night. Every bike was ready, not approximately ready, not good enough for the road ready. Ready, the condition Ethan applied to every machine that left his garage, the one his father had applied before him, the standard that said, if something goes wrong today, it will not be because of something we missed. Gerald Fitch arrived at 7:30 on the Road King Rachel had sourced. He hadn't ridden in 10 years. He sat on the bike for a moment before starting it, getting the feel of it back, the particular adjustment that the body makes when it returns as something it learned long ago. Rachel stood nearby and said nothing. She had assessed that he didn't need instruction and would find it condescending. She was right. He started the bike, sat with Edmo for a minute, found where the weight balanced, and nodded once. "All right," he said. "All right," Rachel said. Tom was running checkpoint logistics at the corner of the parking area, clipboard in hand. Actual clipboard, actual paper, because Tom had developed strong opinions about not trusting technology for things that mattered. And this was something that mattered. He checked each bike off as it cleared inspection and staged it for departure. And he did this with the efficiency of someone who had fully inhabited a role and was no longer self-conscious in it. He had been at Walker's Auto for 4 months. He rode his own bike in the run. He had fixed it himself, fully. Then had watched and asked questions and offered one correction that Tom had caught independently before Ethan pointed it out. The bike ran exquisitely as it should, which was not luck and not talent in isolation, but the compound product of 4 months of sustained attention and the specific teaching of a man who believed that understanding mattered more than procedure. Marcus came to Ethan in at 8 o'clock when the last bikes were staging. "You riding," Marcus said. Ethan looked at the Electra Glide. He had been looking at it all morning, the way you look at something you're not quite ready to touch again, holding the anticipation of it the way you hold any experience that you want to be fully present for and are afraid of rushing. "Yeah," Ethan said. "Lead or follow?" Ethan considered. "I'll find my place," he said. Marcus smiled. It was a full smile, not the managed version, the real one, which Ethan had now seen 3 times in 4 months, and which each time changed the entire quality of Marcus Dalton's face. "That's a good answer," Marcus said. Lily rode in the chase vehicle. His sister-in-law drove. Lily sat in the passenger seat with a window cracked despite the cold, because she wanted to hear the motorcycles ahead of her, and she had her notebook open on her lap, the one she'd started filling 3 weeks ago, which was not a diary and not homework, and which she had described to Ethan when he asked as a book of things worth keeping. He had not asked what was in it. She would show him when she was ready. The run went 60 miles through county roads that curved with the landscape through small towns where people came out to watch from front porches in parking lots, some of them waving, some of them just watching with the particular attention that 32 motorcycles on a Saturday morning commands. The benefit was for veteran services and pediatric care at Millhaven General. Rachel had managed the organizational side with the same precision she applied to everything. And the chapter had been building relationships with both organizations for years, long enough that the run had a reputation, and the reputation brought people out. Carl rode. He had come back to the garage the week before, not for service, but for Tom. And he and Tom had talked for an hour about the run and whether Carl wanted to join it. And Tom had said, "Look, you've got a bike and it's running right. And you've been home for 2 years trying to find the thing that connects you back to being here." And I'm just saying that 60 miles on a clear October morning with 31 other people who are riding for something bigger than themselves is not a bad place to start. Carl thought about it. He called Rachel. Rachel sent him the registration link. He rode. About 40 miles into the run on a straightaway that opened up between 2 hills and gave a full view of the valley below and the mountains beyond and the enormous October sky above all of it, Ethan felt the Electroglide settle into its stride, the particular ease of a machine at its preferred pace, the mechanical equivalent of a deep breath, everything synchronized and running exactly as it was supposed to run. He heard his father. He didn't try to hold on to it or define it or protect it. He let it come through and pass through and settle somewhere in him that was deeper than thought. The specific idle, the voice of the engine at 60 miles an hour, the vibration under his hands that was distinct from any other machine he had ever ridden and that he had not felt in 3 years and that his body had apparently been waiting for with a fidelity that surprised him. He was crying behind his helmet. He let that happen too. After a while, Marcus pulled up alongside him. They rode parallel for a mile, not speaking. You couldn't at this speed, but you didn't need to. Marcus looked at him once. Ethan looked back. Whatever Marcus saw, it was apparently what he was looking for because he nodded once, the same nod that carried more information than most speeches, and dropped back into formation. The benefit dinner was held that evening at the VFW Hall in Millhaven. It was not fancy. It was not supposed to be. Long tables and folding chairs and food made by the same women who made food for every VFW function in Millhaven, going back 40 years. The accumulated institutional knowledge of how to feed a large group of people well on a practical budget. Rachel had organized a brief program, 2 speakers from the Veteran Services Organization, a doctor from pediatrics at Millhaven General who was 40 years old and had the particular quality of someone who had chosen the right life for themselves and never had cause to question it, and then an open section where anyone could speak. Ethan had not planned to speak. He didn't consider himself a speaker. He was a mechanic. He was good with his hands and with engines and with the particular form of intelligence required to listen to a machine and understand what it was saying about itself. He was not good with rooms full of people looking at him. But when the open section arrived and there was a pause and he felt the room waiting, not specifically for him, just waiting the way rooms wait for whoever was going to speak next, he found himself standing up. He didn't plan what to say. He said what was true. "My father ran this garage before me," he said. "He died 6 years ago. He ran it for 31 years, and he never once, not once, turned someone away because of who they were or what they looked like or whether they could pay. He said the measure of a man is who he helps when there's nothing to gain." He stopped. He looked at the room at 17 faces he had met in a storm, and Tom and Charlie and Rachel and Gerald Fitch near the back, with his hands folded on the table. And Carl sitting straight in his chair, with his coffee and 32 other riders who had spent their Saturday doing something for other people because that was the kind of people they were. 4 months ago, 17 people showed up at my garage in the worst storm of the year. I opened the door because I didn't know how to do anything else. I didn't know they would change my life. I only knew they needed someone to open the door. He paused. Everything that's happened since the people in this room, the bike out in the parking lot that my father and I built together when I was 14, a second bay going up in 2 weeks on the back of my property, all of it came from one open door. That's all it was. One door. He looked at Marcus. My father was right. It's not about what you own. It's about who you help when there's nothing to gain. But I want to add something he didn't say because I've learned it this year. He stopped. Sometimes the person you're helping is going to turn around and help you back. Not as a transaction, not as a debt being repaid. Just because that's what kindness does. It doesn't stop when it reaches you. It moves through you, into the next thing, into the next person, into places you'll never see and lives you'll never know. He sat down. That's all I've got." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Charlie started clapping, which was not the kind of thing Charlie normally did. And because Charlie started it, everyone else followed, and the VFW Hall in Millhaven on a Saturday night in October filled with the sound of 32 motorcycle riders and a veteran and a pediatric doctor and a man from Spokane and a young woman who had shown up in a chase vehicle with a notebook full of things worth keeping, all of them making noise for a mechanic from Carver County who had opened a door in the rain. Lily, sitting 3 chairs down from her father, was writing in her notebook. He didn't look at what she was writing. He didn't need to. The second bay went up the following 2 weekends. Marcus ran the crew with the efficiency he brought to everything materials, staged labor-organized sequence planned to the hour. 8 members of the chapter plus Gerald Fitch, who turned out to have construction knowledge he hadn't mentioned, and Charlie, who had overseen more structural work than anyone gave him credit for, and Tom, who learned framing the same way he learned everything else, by watching and asking and doing and refusing to be satisfied with approximately right. Ethan worked alongside them. He was not the kind of man who watched other people build things on his property. Marcus had anticipated this and had simply assigned him tasks without asking which was the correct strategy and which Ethan appreciated. On the second Saturday, Lily came and handed water to everyone. She did this systematically, moving from person to person with a seriousness of purpose that made Gerald Fitch, who was 60 years old and not easily charmed, watch her for a moment and then look at Ethan with an expression that said everything without saying any of it. "She's her father's daughter," Gerald said. "She's her mother's too," Ethan said. "I believe it," Gerald said. On the last day of construction, when the framing was up and the roofing was on, and the concrete floor had cured, and the 4 lifts were installed, and the ventilation was running, and the thing was structurally complete in a way that Ethan would not be able to fully absorb for several days, Marcus stood in the new bay and looked at it and then looked at Ethan. "Right," he said. "Right," Ethan said. "Better than right." Marcus nodded. He walked to the wall between the new bay and the old one, the connecting wall with the door Ethan had asked for wide enough to move equipment through. He put his hand flat on it. "This wall," he said. "What are you going to put on it?" Ethan had thought about this. He had thought about it since Marcus first proposed the expansion, and the answer had arrived quietly sometime in the past week without announcing itself. The way the right answers often arrived, not decided but recognized, as if they had always been there and only needed the right moment to become visible. He told Marcus what he was going to put on the wall. Marcus's expression did not change, but something shifted behind it. The small interior acknowledgement of a man who recognizes in someone else's choice something that confirms what he already believed about them. "Your father would approve," Marcus said. "I know," Ethan said. "So." 3 weeks later, on a morning when the first real snow of the season was coming down, in the kind of light, serious way that Montana snow comes before it decides to mean business, Ethan Walker drove to his garage at 6 in the morning and sat for a moment in his truck, looking at the building. The new sign above the old door was not large. He had made it himself the same way the original sign had been made, painted on wood by hand, the letters careful because he was not a gifted sign painter, but believed that care could compensate for most deficits of natural talent. The old sign still hung where it had always hung. His father's sign. The new one was above the door to the second bay. It said, "Everyone gets a second chance here." He went inside. Tom was already there, coffee made first bike of the day, already on the lift, a 2019 Softail, belonging to a rider from Billings who had driven down specifically because Sandra had told him and Sandra had told everyone she met that Walker's was the place. Tom had the service manual open and was checking his list against the bike's service history with the methodical focus of someone who had internalized not just the techniques, but the philosophy behind them. He looked up when Ethan came in. "Snow," he said. "Snow," Ethan confirmed. "Good day for the inside work," Tom said. He looked back at the Softail. "I've got this one. You've got the transmission job in the old bay." Ethan poured his coffee. He walked through the connecting door into the original bay, his father's bay, the one with the tool wall and the oil-stained map and the space heater in the corner and the 17 mugs on the shelf that nobody had moved because they were part of the inventory now, because some things are in their place not by being useful, but by being present at the right moment. He looked at the wall between the 2 bays. The photograph was mounted there, black and white. Him at 15, his father beside him, the Electra glide between them. His father's hand on the seat, his own face caught in the particular expression of someone who has not yet learned to be unsure, a 15-year-old who believed completely and without evidence that the man next to him could fix anything, knew everything, and would always be there. His father's face in the photograph was looking not at the camera, but at him. Not at the bike, at him. Ethan had not noticed this in the photograph when he was 15, because when you are 15, you are the subject and the world around you is the context, but he noticed it now at 41 and understood what it meant. His father was not proud of the machine. His father was proud of the boy. On the back of the photograph in his aunt's handwriting was what she had sent with it, what Danny had laminated and placed under the seat, and what Ethan had finally read alone late at night, sitting on the milk crate with the garage empty and quiet around him. His father had written it, not recently, long ago, to his sister in a letter about the summer they rebuilt the bike. His aunt had kept the letter, had kept all the letters. The way people keep the things they understand are worth keeping. His father had written, and Ethan thinks he's learning about engines. He's not. He's learning that he can make something complicated work with his own hands, which is the beginning of understanding that most things that seem too hard and are only hard until they aren't. Once a boy knows that nothing frightens him the same way again. I'm not building a motorcycle with my son. I'm building him the kind of confidence that doesn't require an audience. Ethan had read that 3 times alone on the milk crate. He had sat with it the way you sit with things that rewrite everything slightly. Not the facts, but the meaning of the facts, the revised understanding of what you were part of when you didn't know you were part of anything. He looked at the photograph now. His father looking at him on a summer morning in 1989, building him something invisible in the shape of something mechanical. He turned to the transmission job waiting on the lift. He picked up his tools. He got to work. The snow came down steadily through the morning. By 10, Lily called from school to tell him that her class had done show and tell, and she had told the story of the garage and the 17 bikers, and her teacher had asked her to write it out properly, and she wanted to know if that was okay. "It's okay," he said. "Can I use the part about Grandpa's bike?" she said. "All of it," he said. "Use all of it." She hung up. He went back to the transmission. Tom's voice came through the connecting door. "Ethan, Carl's here. He wants to know if we have time for an oil change." "We have time," Ethan said. Marcus called at noon to check on the snow. He did this now, called to check on things, to ask how Tom was doing, to relay information about incoming business, to trade the small practical details of people who have woven their operations together without ceremony or contract. The calls were short. Marcus was not a man who used more words than the situation required. But they were regular, and Ethan had come to count on them the way you come to count on the reliable things in your life. The things whose consistency is itself a form of communication. "Run went well," Marcus said. "Raised $11,000 for the veteran services." "That's good," Ethan said. "Gerald's coming back in spring. He's looking for a bike to buy. I told him you'd help him find the right one." "I will," Ethan said. "Tom should be the one to find it," Marcus said. "He's ready for that kind of assessment." Ethan considered this. "You're right," he said. "I know," Marcus said, and hung up. At 3 in the afternoon, Ethan walked through the connecting door and stood in the new bay. 4 lifts, proper ventilation, concrete floor that Tom had helped pour on the second weekend of construction and that had cured true and level. A tool wall on the east side that Ethan had organized himself, not the same as his father's arrangement, but built on the same principles, the same logic of placement and accessibility, and the belief that a disorganized tool wall was a disorganized mind. Tom was finishing the Softail. He worked with the focused quiet of someone completely inside their task hands, and attention aligned the economy of movement that comes not from haste, but from knowing exactly what you're doing and why. He was 22 years old. He had been at Walker's Auto for 4 months. He was going to be a mechanic. Not approximately. Not as a fallback, as a vocation, the specific kind of knowing that comes from the intersection of aptitude and attention in someone who believed you were worth teaching and showed you where to look. Ethan had been shown where to look by his father. He was showing Tom. Tom would show someone. That was how it worked. That was always how it had worked. Not the formal institutions, not the certificates and the programs and the structured pathways, though those mattered too. The human chain of it, one person at a time, One open door at a time, one 3 in the morning conversation, at a time when the guard was down and the real thing got said, and someone was listening who understood what they were hearing and knew what to do with it. Ethan looked at the new sign above the door. Everyone gets a second chance here. He had put it above the new bay because that was where second chances lived, in the expansion and the growth in the place that hadn't existed before the storm, and the 17 riders and the open door and the chain of choices that followed. But the truth was the first bay had always been that too. His father had made it that 30 years before Ethan thought to put it in words. The sign was new, the promise was old, and it would be kept. Not because it was written above a door, but because Ethan Walker knew, with the clarity of a man who had tested the belief against real conditions and watched it hold, that the only measure of a person that mattered was what they did for someone who couldn't give them anything back, and that this measure applied consistently, without calculation, without ledger, without the need to see the outcome or receive the credit, was not a sacrifice. It was the whole point. It always had been. The snow came down outside. Tom finished the Softail. The garage was full, and the door was open.